I believe Jesus was in very strong physical health, and you'll see in a little later why that's important. The emotional stress, we talked about that before in the Garden of Gethsemane, and all of the things that were happening here during the trials. I'm sure it was very painful for Jesus to stand through those trials and hear all these false things being accused and basically say nothing. The first physical thing that we read about in Scripture is a physical beating, and it's in John chapter 18, verse 24. It says, "Then the detachment of soldiers with its commander and Jewish officials arrested Jesus. They bound him and brought him first to Annas. Then Annas sent him still bound to Caiaphas the high priest." And then further down in John it says, "They spit in his face, they struck him with their fists, others slapped him." Mark 14:64, "Then some began to spit at him. They blindfolded him, struck him with their fists, and said, 'Prophesy.' And the guards took him and beat him." Luke 22:63, "The men who were guarding Jesus began mocking and beating him." So this is the first physical beating that Jesus underwent. And I think as you're reading through the Scripture, it's easy just to gloss over those verses and not pay a whole lot of attention to them. But I guarantee you these were not little love taps that they were giving him. This was an intense physical beating. So he was already beat up before any of the further things that we are going to talk about even happened. Now let's look in detail about the scourging. Several years ago I made this little replica of a cat o' nine tails. And it was something like this. Basically you have a wooden handle and you have 9 strips of leather. And along the leather they would put little jagged pieces of metal or bone or round metal balls. And the idea is to cause as much damage to the flesh as you're doing the scourging. Now, according to Jewish law, the scourging was limited to 39 lashes. The reason for the 39 was that 40 lashes was considered to be fatal. So the idea was to beat this person within right up to the point of death, but then not actually kill the person. And if you just do the math, if you've got 9 different wounds at least, a lot of times there were even more than one per strip. But if you just do the math, 39 times 9, that's 351 different wounds that you would receive from getting a typical Jewish kind of flogging. Now, we know from Roman law that there was no limit to the number of lashes that you could receive, so it's likely that Jesus could have received more than that. It's also interesting that the Romans almost never did both scourging and crucifixion. It really wouldn't make any sense. Crucifixion was the death penalty. Scourging was something less than the death penalty. And I think if you read carefully what Pilate was trying to accomplish there, he sent Jesus off to be scourged, and we'll look later why, but I think Jesus' scourging was particularly intense. And then he brought him back, and he looked, I'm sure, horrible, hardly even human, Scripture says. And when the crowd saw that, Pilate was hoping that it would engender some kind of sympathy, and they would then allow Barabbas to be executed and allow Jesus to be set free. But having one of these or pass out, it was also common for people to die just from scourging. The entire back, from the base of the neck all the way down to the upper thighs, would be basically raw flesh with little or no skin left. Sometimes it was so deep were the wounds that there were even some of the internal organs of the body would be exposed from the flogging. We also read in Scripture that they fashioned a crown of thorns and put the crown of thorns on his head. The thorns were believed to be 2 to 3 inches long, multiple thorns, and when they put that on his head, then they beat him up a second time. And what they did was they took the reed that they had given him as his staff, and they beat him over the head with that reed, beating on that crown of thorns and driving those thorns into his scalp. Let's read about it in Scripture. It says, "They stripped him and put a scarlet robe on him, and then they twisted a crown of thorns and set it on his head. They put a staff in his right hand and knelt in front of him and mocked him. 'Hail, King of the Jews,' they said. They spit on him, and they took the staff and struck him on the head again and again. The pain, the intense headache that would cause, and there's a lot of bleeding that comes from scalp injuries because the scalp is very vascular. It has a lot of blood vessels, so there likely was a lot of bleeding there too. Now, this is a diagram to show you how the scourging took place. They had these wooden posts that were mounted in the ground, and they stayed there all the time, and they would strip the prisoner naked. They would tie their hands up above their head and suspend them. And then two soldiers would stand on either side, and they would alternate their lashes. And as I mentioned before, basically from the base of the neck all the way down to the upper thighs, the entire back would be stripped of most of its skin, and there would just be raw flesh, and the muscles underneath would be exposed. There's a passage of Scripture in 1 Peter 2:24, and an author that I read, did a detailed study of the Greek there, and it indicates that Jesus' flogging was particularly harsh. There's two other reasons why I think this is probably true. First of all, here you have this strong physical specimen of a man who had been a laborer his whole life, and he couldn't carry the crossbeam of the cross. And we'll show you a little later how big that was, but it likely only weighed between 75 and 125 pounds. So it would have been ordinarily easy for Jesus to carry that, and he was unable to carry it and couldn't even remain standing. Secondly, we're going to look at the distance, the amount of time that Jesus survived on the cross. If you look in Mark chapter 15, it says Jesus was crucified at the 3rd hour, which is 9 a.m. in the morning, and he died at the 9th hour, which is 3 p.m. in the afternoon. So Jesus only survived for 6 hours on the cross. So I believe those two facts make it clear that Jesus' flogging was particularly intense, because it was common in that day for crucifixion victims to remain alive on the cross many more hours than that, and frequently they stayed alive for 2 or 3 days. And we'll talk about that a little bit later as well. Now let's look at crucifixion. Crucifixion was started by the Persians. I was actually reading recently in the book of Ezra, chapter 6, verse 11, 450 BC, and it describes crucifixion. It actually calls it impaling. But the Persians invented this, and then the Romans picked it up, and they perfected the technique. And it's designed to be the most intense kind of physical torture that you can think about. It was capital punishment. It was so horrible that it was only done to the most vile of slaves and foreigners, revolutionaries, the worst kind of criminals you can think of. It was designed to be the maximum amount of humiliation and suffering and pain and torture, and it was to display the power and dominance of the Roman Empire. And it was done publicly, and it was put on display for everyone to see, and the message is clear. If you do any of these things, this is what's going to happen to you. Now, this word excruciating is an English word that we're all familiar with, and it's used to describe the most intense kind of physical pain and suffering that you can think about. You think about any sort of injury or disease, what's the most intense pain that you can think about? We call that excruciating pain. The word excruciating literally means out of the cross, which means the worst kind of pain that you can describe or think about is pain that you get during a crucifixion.